Damien lost his job because he helped an old lady fix her car. He was simply driving to work, minding his business, when he saw an old woman standing beside a stalled silver Buick, waving for help. But her car was slightly tilted off the road, the hazard lights blinking weakly like they were running out of battery. And the woman, she didn't look okay. Her coat was too thin, and her hair was whipping across her face in the wind. Damien almost kept driving. Not because he didn't care, but because he had already been warned twice by his supervisor for showing up even a little late. His job at the distribution warehouse in Albany wasn't glamorous, but it paid his rent and kept him afloat. Damien sighed, checked the clock, 7:34 a.m., and pulled over. He didn't know it yet, but this simple moment, this one stop, would drag him into the kind of trouble that makes people stand in their kitchen later, staring at the wall, wondering if they made the dumbest or the most meaningful choice of their life. He climbed out of his car. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he called out. The woman looked relieved, like she'd been holding her breath for the last 10 minutes. "Oh, thank goodness," she said. "I think my car just gave up on me." Her name, he would later find out, was Helen Higgs. And that morning, she needed much more help than she knew how to ask for. Damien tried turning the engine, but it sputtered like something was choking under the hood. He checked the battery cables. They were loose. Loose enough that Helen definitely couldn't fix it herself. He tightened them, tried the engine again, and it roared to life. Helen clapped her hands softly. "You're a lifesaver, young man." "It's no problem," Damien said, though he could feel the pressure building in his stomach. He checked the time. 7:51 a.m. His shift started at 8. He was at least 20 minutes away, and that was without traffic. He told her he had to get going, wished her a good day, and drove off. But the entire drive, he could feel that sinking feeling. The kind that hits you when you know you're about to walk straight into bad news with no excuse strong enough to protect you. And he was right. He rushed into the warehouse at 8:16 a.m., breathing hard, but before he could even clock in, his supervisor, Mike, stepped in front of him, arms crossed. "You're late," Mike said. "I know, but I helped a woman whose car broke down. She was stranded and—" "Don't care," Mike cut in. "You've had warnings." Damien blinked. "So what are you saying?" Mike didn't hesitate. "You're fired." Just like that, Damien felt the ground drop from under him. He didn't argue. What was the point? Mike already made the decision long before Damien walked in. Maybe he was even waiting for this chance. He cleaned out his locker and walked out of the warehouse unable to decide if he was angry, disappointed, or just tired. Losing a job doesn't hit you like a slap. It hits you the way cold water climbs up your legs when you step into a lake. You feel it slowly creeping in, unsettling everything. That night in his small apartment in Albany, he sat on the floor staring at his bills like they were written in another language. Electricity, car payment, student loans. Each one felt like a tiny weight dropping on his chest. And for the next 2 months, he applied to every job he could find. Retail, restaurants, delivery, anything. He heard the same lines over and over. "We'll get back to you. We're not hiring at the moment. Your application looks good, but..." That "but" became the soundtrack of his life. His savings drained so fast it felt like someone poked a hole in the bottom of his bank account. He lived off ramen, skipped meals sometimes, and even sold his old gaming console just to cover his phone bill. He didn't tell anyone what was going on. Not his parents. Not his friends. He was embarrassed. And in America, being jobless felt like you were disappearing while everyone else kept moving. One afternoon, while scrolling through job listings at a cafe, he saw a new posting. Grantwell Industries, one of the biggest companies in New York, was hiring for a logistics coordinator. He knew the competition would be brutal, but he had experience, and honestly, he had nothing left to lose. So he cleaned up, put on his one good shirt, and took a bus to Manhattan early the next morning. When he stepped inside the building, he felt like he didn't belong. Everything was glass and polished metal. People in suits walked around like they had elevators built into their schedules. The receptionist directed him to the 17th floor for interviews. But when he got there, the worst happened. The CEO, Richard Higgs, didn't even let him finish his introduction. "We have more qualified candidates," Richard said, flipping through Damien's resume like it was a takeout menu. Damien tried to stay calm. "Sir, if you give me a chance, I can." "We're done here," Richard said, already looking past him. Damien stood up. "Thank you for your time," he said quietly, even though Richard barely acknowledged him. There's a specific kind of tiredness that hits you when you've been trying your best for so long and it still isn't enough. It's not dramatic. It's not loud. It just makes you feel like sitting down on the nearest bench and questioning everything. Damien walked out of the office, feeling like all the air had left his body. The hallway seemed longer than it did on his way in. The elevator took forever. His thoughts were loud, messy, and painful. As he stepped out into the lobby, the doors opened again, and there she was. The same old woman from the road. The same silver hair, same warm eyes. Walking slowly with a small tote bag in her hand. It took her a second before she recognized him. "Wait, you," she said, pointing gently. "You helped me on the highway 2 months ago." Damien blinked. That was me. Mrs. Higgs, right?" She nodded. "Helen. And what are you doing here?" He didn't want to say it, but the truth slipped out before he could soften it. "I came for a job interview," he said. "Didn't go well." Helen frowned. "Why not?" He shrugged, trying to look like it didn't bother him. "The CEO said they had better candidates." Helen narrowed her eyes. "The CEO?" She paused. "Richard." Damien nodded slowly. Helen muttered something under her breath. Something that sounded a lot like, "He never tells me anything." Then she looked him straight in the face. "Stay right here." She didn't wait for his reaction. She marched straight to the private elevator, the one only executives used, and tapped a code on the panel. Damien stood frozen in confusion. Why was she going upstairs? Why did she look upset? Could this get any stranger? A security guard glanced at Damien as if asking, "You know her?" Damien nodded awkwardly. He didn't know what else to do. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Then 15. He was about to leave when the private elevator dinged again. And this time, Helen stepped out. Not alone. She was followed by Richard Higgs, the CEO himself, walking fast like someone had just dragged him down from a throne. Richard looked right at Damien. Not with annoyance this time. Not with dismissal. But with embarrassment. "Damien, could you come with me for a moment?" Richard asked. Damien had no idea what was happening, but he followed them back upstairs. And that's where things, finally, after months of misery, started to shift. Damien followed Helen and Richard through a quiet executive hallway that looked nothing like the rest of the building. The carpet was thicker, the light softer, and the walls were lined with framed newspaper articles about Grantwell Industries expanding across New York, Boston, Chicago. Basically everywhere Damien never imagined himself working. He felt out of place, walking there in the same shirt he'd worn to 3 other interviews that week. Meanwhile, Richard moved like someone trying to handle a problem without letting it explode, and Helen walked beside him with the calmness of a woman who had lived too long to be intimidated by any even if he happened to be her husband. They stepped into a spacious office with a view of the Hudson River. It was the kind of office that made you stand a little straighter, even if nobody asked you to. Richard closed the door. Helen sat down. Damien stayed standing because he honestly didn't know where to put himself. Helen gestured. "Sit, dear. You look like someone dragged you through 3 job interviews and an airport." He sat down. Mostly because she reminded him of the type of grandmother who didn't accept no unless she asked for it. Richard leaned on the desk and let out a breath. "So, Helen tells me you're the young man who helped her on Route 28. Damien nodded, unsure if this was good or bad. "Yeah. Her battery cables were loose." "And you stopped?" Richard asked. "Yeah. She needed help." "You didn't know who she was?" Richard said, glancing at his wife. Damien shook his head. "No, sir." Helen smiled at that. "Told you. Good people don't need a reason." Richard rubbed his face like he was trying to figure out which version of reality he'd been living in compared to this one. "I turned you down this morning," he said, "without even really considering your application." Damien didn't react much. He was trying to stay respectful. "It's okay." But Helen gave him a look, one of those looks older women have mastered for generations, that clearly said, "Don't sugarcoat his nonsense." Damien cleared his throat. "I mean, it's your company, sir. You're allowed to hire whoever you want." Helen folded her arms. "Richard, tell him why." Richard didn't want to. That was obvious. He finally spoke. "We've been getting a lot of applicants lately. Thousands in some weeks. Thomas, I judge too quickly. I'm not proud of it." Damien wasn't sure what he was supposed to say to that. "I understand." Helen leaned forward. "He does this all the time. Acts like he's too busy to use his eyes." Richard gave her a look. Helen. What? It's true. Damien didn't smile, but the corners of his mouth twitched. These two reminded him of couples who argue all day but somehow still sleep holding hands. Richard sighed. Damien, I didn't know anything about what you did for Helen. I didn't know you sacrificed being on time to help her. And I certainly didn't know you lost your job because of it. Damien asked quietly, She told you all that? Yes. Helen nodded. I said it exactly how he told me. That you stopped on a cold morning, fixed my car, and rushed off like someone running from a parking ticket. Damien blinked. I didn't think it was a big deal. Helen raised both brows. It was to me. The room was quiet for a moment. Not awkward, just full. Like everyone needed time to settle into whatever this conversation was becoming. Finally, Richard straightened up. Damien, I'd like to offer you a second interview. A real one. One where I actually look at your experience. Damien hesitated. Right now? Yes. Damien nodded. Okay. The interview started simple, but it felt strange to sit across from a man who only an hour earlier had dismissed him like an outdated form in a stack of paperwork. Richard asked questions, real questions this time, about Damien's warehouse experience, how he handled scheduling, his ability to coordinate deliveries, how he dealt with difficult supervisors. When that question came up, Damien had to stop himself from saying, by getting fired, apparently. Instead, he said, I try to keep my head down and do my job. But I'll speak up if something affects the team. Helen nodded approvingly, as if grading him silently. The interview took nearly an hour. By the end of it, Richard checked his notes, glanced at his wife, and then looked at Damien. Before we continue, Richard said carefully, Helen told me something else. Damien looked at Helen, confused. I told him you've been out of work for 2 months, she said simply, and that you only went hungry so your bills wouldn't eat you alive. Damien swallowed, embarrassed. I just did what I had to do. Richard shook his head. Sold your belongings to stay afloat? Damien didn't answer at first. Eventually he said, yeah. Helen sighed softly, but not in pity, in respect. Richard looked down at his desk, thinking deeply, then finally said, Damien, I can't undo what happened at your last job. And I can't change how poorly I handled things this morning. But Helen is right about one thing. You helped her without expecting anything. Not even recognition. Helen smiled. I told him that's the kind of person this company needs. Not another resume with fancy words. Richard exhaled and stood up. Damien, we have a vacant supervisor role in our logistics division. Higher pay. Full benefits. It's not entry level. It's a lot of responsibility. Damien's eyes widened. He wasn't even applying for that position. Helen frowned at Richard. You're underplaying it. Tell him the real title. Richard sighed. Logistics Operations Supervisor for the Northeast region. Damien stared at him. Sir, that position requires... You, Helen interrupted. It requires you. Richard shook his head with a faint smile. You remind Helen of her brother. He helped anyone who needed it, even when it cost him time, money, opportunities. She said you're cut from the same cloth. Damien couldn't hide the emotion that rose in him. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, just real. His throat tightened in a way that made it hard to swallow. He looked down at his hands. I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything yet, Richard said. Just think it over. Helen snapped lightly. He doesn't need to think. Give him the job. Richard gave her a look. Helen, this is still a business. And he's still qualified, she countered. The way she said it left no room for discussion. Damien let out a small breath. If I'm being honest, sir, I'd be grateful for the chance. Richard nodded. Then it's yours. Damien just sat there, stunned. Not frozen, just overwhelmed in a very normal, very human way, trying to wrap his head around how life could flip in less than a day. 1 minute he was sitting in a bus seat wondering which bill to postpone. Now he was being offered a position with a salary he'd never even imagined earning. Helen stood up and patted his arm. Good. Now that we've settled that, how about lunch? You look like you haven't eaten since last night. She wasn't wrong. They took the elevator down together. The executive cafeteria looked more like a small restaurant. Employees walking past were whispering, wondering who Damien was and why the CEO himself was showing him around. They sat at a small table with a window view. Helen insisted he order whatever he wanted. Richard barely spoke. He seemed deep in thought, like he was replaying the whole morning and feeling guilty about it. At one point he looked up. "Damien, I want to ask you something." "Sure." "You said your last supervisor fired you because you helped my wife?" "Yeah." "How long were you late?" 16 minutes. Richard's jaw tightened. 16 minutes got you fired? "I'd already been late twice in the previous month," Damien said. "For what reason?" "One was because my bus route was delayed. The other, I wasn't feeling well but tried to show up anyway." Helen shook her head. "That's ridiculous." Richard muttered, "That's poor management, not poor performance." They ate quietly for a few minutes. Then Helen looked at Damien with a strange softness in her eyes. "You know, I don't believe in coincidences." Damien smiled a little. "Me neither. Especially after today." Helen leaned back. "I've met so many people, through charity events, hospital visits, everyday errands. And almost none stop to help unless they see a camera or want something out of it. You didn't ask me for a thing." "That's just how I was raised," Damien said. "My dad always said if you can help someone you should." Helen nodded slowly. "Keep that. Don't let the world knock it out of you." After lunch, Richard took Damien to HR to sign the paperwork. The HR manager nearly spilled her water when she saw the title he was signing for. "You are the new regional supervisor?" she asked, surprised. Richard answered, "Yes." She nodded quickly, no questions asked. As they walked toward the elevator, Helen tapped Damien lightly. "Tomorrow, come by my house. I want to introduce you to someone." Damien blinked. "Who?" "My son," she said casually. "He handles our philanthropic foundation. He'd like you," Richard added, "and don't think you owe us anything. You earned this today." Damien nodded quietly. As he walked out of the building, the sunlight felt different. Not blinding, just clearer. He stepped outside and checked his phone. It buzzed, an email from one of the places he'd applied to weeks ago. "We regret to inform you." He laughed, deleted it, and kept walking. Something strange happened on the way home. He passed that lonely stretch of road on Route 28 where he'd found Helen stranded months ago. The same spot. The same cracked shoulder. And he thought to himself, if I had just kept driving, if I had worried more about being late, none of this would have happened. But that wasn't the end of the story. Because the deeper truth behind what happened, the real reason Helen insisted he meet her family, the real reason she pushed so hard for Richard to hire him, none of that had been revealed yet. The twist was still coming. Damien didn't plan to stand in anyone's living room that afternoon. He expected rejection at the job interview, maybe a long walk home, maybe another day of uncertainty. But instead, he was sitting on a gray couch in a quiet house on the Upper West Side, across from the old woman he had helped on that lonely highway 2 months ago. Helen Higgs. He kept looking around her living room, trying to understand why someone like her, calm, wealthy, very put together, would invite him inside after recognizing him in the hallway of a giant company. "You look confused," Helen said as she lowered herself into a chair. Damien let out a breath. "Honestly, ma'am, today has been insane. I didn't expect to see you again. And I really didn't expect, well, any of this." "I know," she said, giving him a small smile. "But I need to show you something before we talk about the job." She walked to an old wooden drawer near the TV stand. Her steps were slow, careful, like she'd walked through this memory hundreds of times and still wasn't ready for it. She opened the drawer and pulled out a thin envelope. She sat back down and handed it to him. "Go on," she said quietly. "Open it." Inside was a picture. A younger Helen. A young man beside her, holding a red motorcycle helmet. Both were smiling like people who had no idea life had sharp edges waiting for them. "That's my brother," she said. "His name was Joshua." Damien held the picture carefully. "He looks like someone everyone liked." "He was she said, her voice tightening. He was the type of person who always stopped to help strangers. Boys. Didn't matter if he was late for work, late for dinner, didn't matter. If he saw someone stranded, he stopped. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself. One night, he broke down on a highway outside Albany. No signal. Cold weather. Cars kept passing. People looked, but no one stopped. She paused. By the time someone finally pulled over, it was too late. Damien felt the weight of the room change. The kind of silence where people don't move because they know it matters. I was 23, Helen continued. He was 19. And I spent years asking myself why nobody cared enough to stop for him. Damien lowered his head. I'm so sorry. She smiled weakly. I don't tell many people about Joshua. I don't even keep that picture out. But when you stopped for me 2 months ago. She looked directly at him. It felt like the world finally sent the kind of man my brother needed that night. Damien didn't know what to say. All he could manage was, I didn't think twice. You needed help. That's exactly why, she said. And Damien, I need you to understand this next part. I'm not helping you because I owe you for that day. I'm helping you because something in me healed when you stopped. Something I didn't even realize still hurt. She stood up, steadier now. You lost your job trying to save me. And I'm not letting that be the last chapter. Damien tried to smile, but frustration slipped in. Ma'am, I've been trying for 2 months. I've applied everywhere. I can't keep asking my brother to cover rent. I feel like I'm dragging behind in life. I can't believe this, he said. Helen smiled. Believe it. And believe this too. The elevator rose. You didn't just save me on that road. You saved the memory of someone I loved. My brother deserved someone like you that night. And now, I get to make sure the world doesn't overlook someone like you ever again. Damien nodded slowly. Thank you, truly. You don't owe me thanks, she said. Just do good work. And when you see someone who needs help, promise me you'll stop. He nodded. I will. Good, she replied. Then we understand each other. The elevator reached the top floor. The doors opened. A new life waited. And Damien stepped out. Tell us your name and where you are watching from to get a special shout out on our next video tomorrow. Subscribe for more stories.